Today's lesson is on the endocrine system. This lesson actually occurs as a three-part series of PowerPoints. This will be part one of the endocrine system. The 5 objectives that I have provided are the objectives for all 3 of the presentations. Each objective has several parts to it, so I'd like you to pay attention to the objectives. Be sure that you read over them before you actually observe and listen to the PowerPoint presentation, because it will prepare your mind for what you're going to hear, and you'll be able to learn it better, and you'll be able to understand it better. So here are 4 of the objectives. The 5th objective is on this last slide here, or the next slide. So now we begin to talk about the endocrine system. The endocrine glands, organs, and cells are a collection of the same glands, organs, and cells that are devoted to secreting hormones that travel through the bloodstream to distant sites to impact tissues in a whole different area of the body. So an endocrine gland will secrete a hormone. It travels through the blood, and it's going to act on a totally different organ or tissue than where it came from. We have 2 types with regard to location. The central endocrine glands include the hypothalamus, both parts of the pituitary gland, the anterior and posterior pituitary glands, and the pineal gland. All of these 4 central endocrine glands are located in the brain. Peripheral endocrine glands are glands that are outside the central nervous system. They include the thyroid gland, the parathyroid glands, the thymus gland, the pancreas, specifically the islets of Langerhans, which is the endocrine part of the pancreas, the adrenal gland, which has 2 parts, the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla, the ovaries, the testes, the kidneys, and the placenta. There are other peripheral endocrine glands. I could have included the atria of the heart, the liver, the bone marrow. I could have included the adipose tissue, or the fat. And there's a few other peripheral endocrine glands to boot, but these are the more commonly acknowledged ones. This slide shows the location of some of the endocrine glands. If you'll notice on the right, you have the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland. They're within the brain. Those are the central glands. On the left are a few of the peripheral glands: thyroid gland, adrenal gland, the pancreas, the ovary, and the testes. Endocrine glands, as I said a moment ago, are glands that secrete their products into the bloodstream. These products are called hormones. The blood transports the hormones to their sites of action. Hormones may be classified chemically as either amino acids, peptides, or proteins, or steroids. The amino acid, peptide, protein class all bind to receptors in the cell membrane and do not enter the cell at all. They don't have to enter the cell to bring about their mechanism of action. On the other hand, steroid hormones go through the cell membrane and interact with receptors inside the cell to bring about their actions. This slide shows an overview of the pituitary gland and the glands that it controls. The first 6 arrows from left to right represent hormones from the anterior pituitary. The last 2 represent hormones from the posterior pituitary. For each hormone then, and the name of the hormone is written below each of the organs. Each hormone will affect its target tissue, and such that prolactin will have an effect on the breast, ACTH affects the adrenal gland, TSH the thyroid gland, growth hormone, or GH, affects bone as well as some other tissues, LH and FSH affect the ovaries and the testes. The last two arrows, as I said, represent hormones from the posterior pituitary. These hormones have an effect on the kidney, which is ADH, and the uterus for oxytocin. The next slide is similar to the previous one. I think the picture gives you a little bit more information. If you look in the center at the top, you see the hypothalamus above. Then you see a stalk or infundibulum that leads down to the pituitary gland. To your left, that part of the gland is the anterior pituitary. The next slide is similar to the previous one. I think the picture gives you a little bit more information. If you look in the center at the top, you see the hypothalamus above. Then you see a stalk or infundibulum that leads down to the pituitary gland. To your left, that part of the gland is the anterior pituitary gland. So you'll see again the hormones from the anterior pituitary, each of which are going to their target tissues for the blood. Prolactin goes to the mammary gland, growth hormone to the bone, muscle, and adipose tissue. The gonadotropins, FSH and LSH, go to the ovaries and testes. ACTH goes to the adrenal cortex, and TSH goes to the thyroid gland. Some of these hormones have SH at the end of them, which means stimulating hormone. So TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone. FSH is follicle stimulating hormone, referring to the follicles of the ovaries and certain cells of the testes. This picture shows to good advantage the adrenal gland. If you look at that one on the right, the middle picture, it says adrenal cortex. The golden outer rim is the adrenal cortex. The inner reddish colored structure is the adrenal medulla. The adrenal gland. This slide shows another way of looking at the pituitary gland and its target glands. Each box represents a gland, basically. The first, the orange box on the left, says the anterior pituitary releases a hormone. It's called a tropic hormone. Tropic means simply that it has an effect on. So tropic hormone, or H1, is going to have an effect on the target gland. The primary target gland, the middle box, is going to respond to the first hormone by secreting a hormone of its own called H2. H2, or hormone 2, travels through the blood to the secondary target gland to have an effect on that secondary target gland. That gland will either secrete a hormone of its own or it will produce some other effect. To illustrate this general example, we have at the bottom the anterior pituitary secretes ACTH, which travels to the adrenal cortex, causing it to release aldosterone, a hormone. That hormone travels through the blood to the kidneys and causes the kidneys to reabsorb more sodium. This picture shows something similar to what you saw before, but this adds the hypothalamus into the whole picture. And so we see here that the hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary, and we want to start at number 1, which is on the right in the red circle. It says that there's a deviation from the set point of a target gland function. That deviation can be, either a decrease in the function of a target gland, or it could be an increase in that function. Anything from the blood glucose level getting too high or too low to any number of other things, the estrogen release being too high. But some deviation occurs from what is normal. This signals the hypothalamus, which sends a hormone labeled as number 2 in the picture. The hormone goes from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. This is called a releasing hormone. The releasing hormone is actually what tells the pituitary what to do. The releasing hormone will signal the anterior pituitary to release a hormone of its own, which is represented by the number 3. That hormone travels through the blood to the target gland or organ. The target gland or organ will have an effect of its own. It will either secrete a hormone or it will produce some other physiological effect. When this hormone or other effect takes place, there is a return of the body to normal, a return to homeostasis. The hypothalamus will detect this also, and then it will decrease its function, as you see in number 6, returning everything back to normal again. So this should look familiar to you, because all the way from deviation from the set point to the very end, the decrease in hypothalamic function. All of this is part of the process called negative feedback, which is the way the secretion of many hormones is controlled. So, at the risk of being redundant, these are the hormones of the anterior pituitary gland: growth hormone, prolactin, adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. Look at that word a moment. Adreno has to do with the adrenal gland. Cortico, specifically the adrenal cortex. Tropic means to have an effect on. So ACTH. Thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, is another hormone. The two gonadotropins, follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, or LH. The word gonadotropin means to have an effect on the gonads, and so both FSH and LH affect the gonads, that is, the ovaries and the testes. If you'll look at the hormones that have an asterisk next to them, those are hormones that are controlled by negative feedback, but they're not the only ones. So growth hormone stimulates the growth and development of certain tissues, including bone, cartilage, the adipose tissue, and the muscle. It also stimulates the liver to release hormones of its own, called insulin-like growth factor. Prolactin is active under two situations. It stimulates the mammary gland to grow and develop, and it stimulates milk production in a woman after she has given birth. When we talk about the endocrine system, we oftentimes have to talk about certain abnormalities that can occur with regard to endocrine system. With regard to growth hormone, there are two different kinds of syndromes that can occur. One is a hypersecretion syndrome. This means that the pituitary gland produces too much growth hormone. These conditions, called giantism and acromegaly, are both due to, most of the time, due to a tumor of the anterior pituitary. But the tumor is rarely cancerous. It's usually benign, but it can still wreak havoc on the body. In an individual whose pituitary gland becomes abnormal while they're still a child or adolescent, while they're still growing, in other words, that person will develop giantism or gigantism, which is another word for it, if that condition is left untreated. Giantism is actually pretty rare, but it is involved with the child growing very rapidly, and the child doesn't quit growing when all of his or her friends are, reaching their final height. They're just getting started, basically, and they will grow to a height of anywhere from 7 to 9 feet. The height is not the only thing affected in giantism, though. The facial bones, the hands, and the feet will enlarge. Different metabolic abnormalities can occur, too, including diabetes mellitus. Acromegaly is similar to giantism because it's caused by the same type of problem, meaning too much growth hormone in the blood. But this is something that occurs after someone has become an adult. They're no longer growing, their growth plates have closed, so they're not able to grow any taller, but their hands, feet, and face will enlarge. The teeth will spread wide apart. There's just an unusual appearance to the individual. They just have coarse features to their face. Again, metabolic abnormalities such as diabetes are very common in someone with acromegaly. The other end of the spectrum then would be not enough growth hormone or hyposecretion of growth hormone. This causes a type of dwarfism called achondroplasia, which is also called pituitary dwarfism. This is the most common type of dwarfism, although there are other types. The signs of achondroplasia are short stature, in which the child, once the person quits growing, they usually don't grow taller than 4 to 4.5 feet, 4.5 feet. The forehead is usually enlarged. The head is usually larger than normal. The jaw protrudes. The legs will be bowed. The feet will be short and flat. The individual will be double jointed. So this is a characteristic appearance that achondroplastic dwarfs will have. Oftentimes the vision will also be affected. In certain other kinds of dwarfism, the adult height doesn't even attain 3 feet. Two other hormones of the anterior pituitary are ACTH and TSH. ACTH stimulates the adrenal gland cortex. It causes the adrenal gland to release hormones of its own, called cortisol and aldosterone. Thyroid stimulating hormone, as the name implies, stimulates the thyroid gland, causing it to release hormones called T3 and T4. The gonadotropins are FSH and LH. FSH has these actions in the female. FSH stimulates egg development or oogenesis. It also stimulates the ovaries to release hormones, estrogen and progesterone. In males, FSH has a single action, and that is stimulation of sperm development, known as spermatogenesis. The other gonadotropin is LH. In females, LH stimulates the ovaries to release progesterone mainly. This occurs primarily toward the latter half of the female cycle. It also stimulates the development of a structure called the corpus luteum in the ovary that basically is the remnant of the follicle that resulted after ovulation occurred. The corpus luteum, under the direction of LH, will continue to develop if a pregnancy has occurred, and that corpus luteum then secretes large quantities of hormones, estrogen, but mainly, especially progesterone, that will maintain the pregnancy until the placenta is able to grow large enough to start functioning. LH in males stimulates the release of testosterone by the testes. There are two posterior pituitary gland hormones, ADH and oxytocin. A little word about these two is that these hormones are actually produced in the hypothalamus, but they're stored in the posterior pituitary gland until they're needed. So both oxy and ADH are produced by the hypothalamus. They travel from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary, where they are stored until needed. Oxytocin is stimulated, the release is stimulated by two different factors. One of these occurs in a woman who's pregnant and whose fetus is at term, meaning that if the baby is born, it will be fully developed. There is an unknown signal or signals that come from the pregnant uterus at term that travel to the hypothalamus, causing it to release oxytocin and causing the posterior pituitary gland to release oxytocin. This is going to start the labor process. Another condition in which oxytocin is released is during breastfeeding. So sensory impulses coming from the milk ducts of the mammary gland, occurring from the action of the breastfeeding infant. These impulses travel up through nerves to the hypothalamus, causing the release of oxytocin at that time also. The effects of oxytocin, I alluded to one of them, and that is that oxytocin stimulates the uterus to contract, bringing about labor and maintaining labor, as well as causing milk to be ejected from the milk ducts during the breastfeeding process. There's another effect of oxytocin that's pretty well established, but it's not totally established, but it's called enhanced maternal-infant bonding. So when a child is breastfeeding, or even if the mother just hears the child cry or sees the baby, that will cause oxytocin to be released. And not only does it cause milk to start flowing from the breast, but it also causes in the woman feelings of love and tenderness toward the baby. It's interesting, but the same thing is believed to happen in men. Men have oxytocin also, and for a long time scientists wondered, why would men need oxytocin? And it's believed then that if the baby cries, or when the man sees his child, oxytocin will be released in him, and this will also bring about those same feelings of love and tenderness toward the baby. The other hormone of the posterior pituitary is antidiuretic hormone. The release of antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, occurs due to two main factors. One of these is increased blood osmolality. This has to do with the degree of dehydration of the blood plasma, I guess you could say. There's a general dehydration of the cells as well. So antidiuretic hormone is stimulated by this increase in osmolality, or you could say osmolarity, which is very similar, of the blood, and as it travels through the hypothalamus, it signals the ADH to be released. Another signal is thirst. The effects of antidiuretic hormone are that number one, the hormone will cause a person to drink more liquids. It will cause the kidneys to excrete less water in the urine. If you think about that, at first this may sound like two different disparate effects that are unrelated, but that's not the case. If you think about increased drinking of liquids, this is going to increase the amount of water that's in the blood plasma. If you remember, the plasma is about 50% of the total blood volume. If you add water to that, then you're going to increase the volume of the plasma. Decreased excretion of water by the kidneys or in the urine, again, is going to result in increased water content of the plasma. So both of those effects end up doing the same thing. ADH will also increase the blood pressure. In which ADH is not secreted in adequate amounts. It's called diabetes insipidus. I'll talk about the condition first, and then I want to be sure that I mention the other kind of diabetes, diabetes mellitus, and we'll talk about the difference in those two diseases. Diabetes insipidus, as I said, is due to inadequate secretion or production or storage of the hormone ADH. The symptoms of diabetes insipidus are intense thirst, excretion of a high volume of urine every day. This is called polyuria. Poly means many or a lot. Urea is urine. Up to 20 liters a day of urine can be excreted. If you think about 20 liters, think about 10 2-liter Diet Cokes. Think about 10 2-liter Diet Cokes. That would be a whole lot of urine, wouldn't it? Or another way of looking at it would be, about 5 gallons, a little over 5 gallons in a day's time. So a large quantity of urine is being lost. This makes a person so thirsty all of the time. And the urine is actually very dilute. Another symptom is nocturia, which means the individual gets up at night to urinate. That disease can be treated, but it can also be fatal if untreated. Now let's look at the word diabetes. The word diabetes all by itself means to flow through. This refers to urine. So in both diabetes insipidus and diabetes mellitus, which is the one we normally think of, the diabetes mellitus is the more common one. But in both of those conditions, there is an increased urination for very different reasons. But if to flow through implies urination, then there's an increased flowing through of water through the system in both types of diabetes. We know what causes diabetes insipidus. This is insufficient antidiuretic hormone being released. We will talk later about why an individual with diabetes mellitus would have increased thirst and increased urination. If you look at that last line where it says polyuria and polydipsia, the sentence says that in both types of diabetes, the individual has polyuria, which you know means increased urination, and polydipsia, which means increased thirst. Now at this time you need to proceed to the second part of the endocrine system. There are 3 parts altogether. The second part is about the same length as this one. This slide, or this actually concludes the